How's your work-life balance? Are you happy with your career trajectory? Are you finding meaning in your work, or is it just for a paycheck? On today's episode of the Live Faith First podcast, I interviewed Jeff Haanen. He started the Denver Institute of Faith and Work and wrote a book called Working from the Inside Out. And we discuss all of those things, including generational questions of what should we be looking for in our careers as we begin and as we come to the twilight of our careers. So check out today's episode of the Live Faith First podcast. Welcome to the Live Faith First podcast. I'm Elliot Sands, and I'm with Jeff Haanen, founder of Denver Institute for Faith and Work, and the author of several books, including Working from the Inside Out, which we're going to discuss today. So, Jeff, thank you for joining the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Elliot.
Yeah, I'm super excited for the conversation. We spend a lot of time every day working. We say, right, often more than sleeping, and often more with our families. So getting this better will be good. So as we get started, would you give us a cliff notes of your life? Where were you born? Where were you raised? A little bit about your upbringing. How did you get where you are today?
Born in the frozen tundra of Minnesota. That is where I grew up, outside of Minneapolis, where as an 8th grade kid and you walk to school, your hair freezes to your head. So that's where I grew up, right outside of Minneapolis. Grew up with my mom and my sister. My dad also lived in town. Went to college in Indiana at Valparaiso University. So I did study a bit of theology there, but I actually ended up studying economics and Spanish. I met my bride out there our first year of college, and we got married after college, which is a fun story. She was a soccer player, so I figured out soccer. Yeah, I figured out soccer after I started dating my wife. So offsides, that was a mystery to me for at least 3 years. Couldn't figure it out. And then Cliff's Notes just a little bit after that. We graduated from school, and then we were adventuresome 22-year-olds, and so we decided to go to South America. We did some traditional sort of missionary work there, learned the language, traveled around. My wife got a great scholarship. I worked at a Christian ministry for a year, and then I came back and did seminary to the United States, and now I've been in Colorado ever since. So I've been in Colorado now for 18 years, married to my bride Kelly of 18 years as well. So we came out basically right after we got back from South America, and I have 4 daughters. So I have an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 15-year-old. So me and the women, me and Milo the dog, hold it down together. Mutual support.
That is great, and you've packed them close enough together where you got all kinds of stuff going on in the house any given day, I'm imagining. So
yeah. I was just reflecting this morning when I was doing my devotions, is that I'm the kind of guy that'd be pretty happy with like a few projects, reading a book and then going out inside and exercising. And my life is just not that. It's just nuts. And it's soccer and work and going everywhere and dealing with things that come up and then fixing the house and all sorts of things. So God has a sense of humor.
Yes, he does. And maybe someday that will be a reality. But
maybe someday.
As of today. Hey, could you talk a little bit about the current state of work and happiness or job satisfaction in the U.S. right now? Just what does our world look like? We're post-COVID. We're kind of this maybe hybrid or working from home still thing. Like, what is the workplace looking like now? What are stats telling us about people's happiness and all of those pieces?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question, and it's hard to make the generalization. So you can see the Gallup polls about the number of people that are engaged or disengaged. I've come to somewhat distrust them, because they have a business plan behind their polls of, hey, we can help you with workplace engagement. But they're good polls. The reality is most people are still checking in and checking out of their jobs, and they don't find a ton of, I think, personal identity in it. I wrote a little bit in my book about the difference between sort of professional and working class communities, because I think that can be pretty different as well. Most professionals tend to find a lot of their identity and sort of their pathway for impact through their jobs, and they tend to be quite engaged. So if you're flipping open your laptop at 9 p.m. at night to get stuff done, you're in that professional category. The vast majority of Americans, though, do not do that. It's just not how you think about work. And many of them are engaged, enjoy their work quite a bit, but it finds a different place in their heart as well. I would say, since you brought up COVID, I do think some things changed. I do think something's changed. I think the ties to employers and loyalty got even less so, and institutional loyalty became
Mm.
less so after you see, apparently the willingness to cut a whole bunch of people very quickly, um, with sometimes the lack of cuts on executive salaries. So I think that happened. I also think there was a New York Times article I thought was helpful. They wrote that we were in the age of anti-ambition. And so when you're talking about this in a generational level, I think Gen Z is thinking pretty differently about work. It's not so much about up and to the right and building sort of my big thing. And that, of course, is for some people. But I think most want work to fit in a comfortable place of their life. I think a good flexibility, a good culture, a place that they enjoy is much more important than either money or success or impact for most people. So again, it's hard to summarize the state of work in America because you have different ethnic groups, you have different ages, you vastly different sectors, different social classes. But I do think some things have changed.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and one of the bigger things here in the Silicon Valley is the back to the office movement, or protest against, and it's pretty interesting. My wife's company is at the you have to be in 3 days a week right now, and she also works with a bunch of lawyers. So this next part of the story will maybe make you smile, but it was kind of funny because they're asking all of these detailed questions, like, well, wait a second. So if I come in from like 10 a.m. to 11 a.m., does that count as a day? And all of these nuances. And my wife's like, what are we, seventh graders, that we have to like parse out every little bit of what it means to come back, or just come to work, just come in the office. And anyway, it's an interesting movement, especially when you look back to say 2019, where work from home hybrid was an ishish kind of around thing, but not a
Yeah.
major thing. And now, anyway, it's an interesting move. And when you see it on the employer side, sorry, and I'll let you go in here, but on the employer side, so often on the jobs that you see available, they're all really now they're in office, like they're not even promoting these jobs as hybrid as much anymore. So it's a
Yeah.
interesting movement.
Well, I think it is a tension point because I think it's not only about in or off or out of the office. I think it's about power. And do I have the say so about my work day, when I work, how I get things done, where I'm at, whether I can go leave early one day and then work in the evening? I think that really did shift that,
Yeah.
especially in sort of tech world. I think everybody wants that. That's almost like a given. And I think employers find it very difficult to build a culture in that context. And I also think it's very hard to build sort of team unity, team like cohesion. We're building something together and then it feels like almost like everybody on my team's a contractor. Everybody, like, I don't see them much. Everybody's sort of doing their own thing, and they might get a better job somewhere else, particularly in Silicon Valley, or particularly with the folks that have AI talent.
Yeah.
They're easily headhunted by others, and so I do think there's challenges both ways there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and yeah, just talking about work culture, and you talk about that some in the book, but it is hard to build that kind of culture over Zoom. It's also challenging, where a lot of forward movement happens around the water cooler, right? Where you're kind of there together, and you're walking down the hallway and you run into somebody, and man, I was thinking about that project you're working on, and things happen that way. So I'm really curious to see what the next 5, 10, 15 years starts to look like in relation to collaboration, culture building, and kind of how that works itself out, and
Yeah,
and and what that looks like. Because I also agree with the freedom piece. Like, man, I got to pick up my kid at 2 when they're out of school. Can I have the freedom to do that and then get back
yeah.
on again? And how do I have a life and work? And anyway,
Yeah, and I do think though that last comment I'll make on this is those though that are in person, and particularly those that have great human relational skills, they're going to find a lot more opportunities for promotion and moving up the ladder. Those, but that's interesting. A lot of people maybe don't even want that. They sort of want work again to fit in a bucket. They'll do their thing. They'll take their compensation, and then they'll go find meaning and do work in other places. And so I think it depends a lot on what people want. If people do have sort of more of those aspirations to grow in their career, I do think some of that in-person stuff is really important. And it is inconvenient. I'd also say too, on conflict resolutions, one of the chapters in my book was about a brace relationship. It's not impossible online, but it is so much harder.
Yeah.
It's you just have to be in person with people and sit together and think we're both individually listen to folks. And so doing that kind of hard work, that if there's two people together, whether that's a marriage or coworkers, there will be conflict. You just have to find ways to be able to do that in person at least sometimes. So I do think that face-to-face relationship thing is an incarnational commitment that we need to have.
Yeah. And as you know, people, I guess it can go either way, but often your grace level increases the more I know you and know your story, and the more
Totally.
we've worked together, where you get to the point where you're like, that doesn't sound like Jeff.
Hmm.
I wonder if something's happened in his home. Like, I wonder if there's something else going on that I'm not aware of, because he responded in a way that's not congruent with the way he normally would respond, or, whatever that looks like. And if I'm not with you enough to know you that well, I can't make that assumption. So then I just assume, oh, he's not a nice guy. Nah, he's just short and curt, and that's just who he is, and that's fine. But I don't know you enough to go, oh no, that's actually unusual for Jeff. This other piece is usual, and you don't get that when you're not around somebody working with them, even if you're not working on a project together, but in the same space on a regular basis.
I agree.
Hey, I want to move to the creation story, because I find it interesting. Of course, God gave Adam work, right, before the fall. So Genesis chapter 2, it's a good thing. Hey, Adam, you have purpose. Go name all the animals. Then, of course, the fall happens, and the promise then changes to, oh, your fields are going to be full of weeds, so you're now going to toil when you work. And so I have this question for you. What does it look like to bring us back towards experiencing that joy in work, even though there's promised weeds? We always know there's going to be trouble, but what is there a movement that we can move back towards that joy, that maybe purpose that we get out of work that we had prior to weeds entering the workplace?
Yeah. So yeah, you summarized the creation story well. It started off well, called into working alongside God to bring about flourishing in his world, very kind of reformed narrative on work. Then things go very, very bad. One of the things I think that's important about the Genesis narrative is there's thorns and thistles, in Genesis 3. But then there's this, flaming sword that says you actually can't get back to the Garden of Eden. The only way you get back to the tree of life is actually when the tree of life comes back up again, is in the renewed heavens and earth.
Yeah.
And so this is one of the things too. I think there's a very, in some of the communities I hang out with, which sounds like most of your listeners, they're believers and they're professionals, and they have a very high vision of, we can totally solve that problem if we work very hard. And that is very much, there's a good instinct there. And yet the biblical story says sin is bigger than you and you can't do much about it, actually. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think that's an important word for professional communities to hear, is the real individual and systemic power of sin in finance and tech, in the professions, in our work. And I think that's important. So I did want to emphasize that. And then you said, but can we get back to that joy at work? And this is a part of my own story. One of the reasons I wrote the book, I did my theology. I, wanted to figure out the place of work in Scripture, and found that it was both there at the beginning and at the end, and realized that work is an incredible way to influence culture, to bring about flourish in your communities. There's all these good things. Having said that, I would oftentimes come home from the workday. I didn't feel any of that joy. None of it. I felt tired. I felt the highs were so high. I was on top of the world, and I felt arrogant. When I was low, I felt like nothing, and depression was sweeping over me. I mean, I just felt all of these things. Even I was leading a ministry focused on faith and work, and working with amazing people, doing stuff with really generous donors. But I actually wasn't experiencing in my own work a lot of that day-to-day joy. And so a lot of the shift, which is the key theme of working from the inside out, it wasn't necessarily away from external impact. It's just that you actually have to start that conversation in your interior world. Because I think, and this is the brief summary of the book, Joy is found when we're participating with God in all of life,
Hmm.
when his presence is with us in the moment to moment, in our work and in our family, and we are just drawing in his joyful life, and we have this sense of him being near us. It could have been the tabernacle, over 2,000 years ago. I'm sorry, over 4,000 years ago, or Jesus's presence through the power of the Spirit today. Actually, I think the way we learn to walk with the Spirit through Christ is where you find the joy in work. It's not about the impact. It's not about the big things we're building. It is actually just about our interaction with Christ.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And you have this framework for connecting with God's journey with humanity, work and God's journey with humanity. We start with creation, and then the fall, and then calling, and then renewal. And I love that kind of trajectory, which we see as we read through the Bible. But then you connected each of those to kind of what are some maybe some interior draws that we have towards work and so on. Would you tell us a little bit about that flow there, that creation, fall, calling, renewal kind of flow, and how that might
Yeah.
affect our work?
Yeah, happy to. And I think that's kind of a reformed summary of the biblical narrative: creation, fall, redemption, and then consummation. And I just apply that. You can apply those things to your work, and it'll be a little strange, I think, for you if you're, working in Silicon Valley, or working as a water plant operator. It's a little strange to do this, but I think it's very faithful. And I think what you can do is you could say something simple like creation. What is actually good about my work? About the product or service I provide, about the company I'm working for? Where can I really get behind? So I have a friend who was speaking at like a ERG, employee resource group at Toyota, a bunch of believers there. And there's a lot of good values and a lot of good stuff you can get behind at Toyota. And that would be the creational goodness of transportation, of um, uh, the types of people you get to work with. I think the creation narrative can say, what is good that I can get really behind here? The fall part is there's stuff that's broken. There's broken in me, there's broken in my team, there's broken in our company as well as our industry. You can go from very personal to very broad. You do have to take a look at that, because if you believe the biblical story, we are on this side of Eden and sin is everywhere. And we actually have to name sin for sin, whether it's systemic or individual. I think the third move is that consummation. As you could imagine, if those broken things were healed, what might they look like, right? What might a redeemed way of doing this product or service, or what then might this team dynamic look like? You can imagine that God gives us an imagination, even for stuff that there's not directly Bible verses for what it means to, work in finance. I mean, there's a lot of stuff about money, but there's not always times Bible verses that are direct one-to-one correlation, right? For all the different complexities of, law or healthcare or manufacturing, say. But you can imagine what would healed look like. And then if you even imagine that redeemed world, your job is ultimately not the Redeemer. Your job is to respond to the voice of the Redeemer.
Hmm.
And he does summon us into his service, to walk alongside him as he walks alongside us. And that's that fourth piece, is calling. As you could say, okay, that would be what this would look like. What is of which I have agency, which I have say so? What's my little thing to do here today? And you could take a look at your task list of think, this is a big redemptive opportunities that seems to be right in front of me right here, right now. You don't have to go fix everything that's wrong in the world. If you read too much news, that's what you end up feeling like. It's like, I am overwhelmed and anxious and I can't do everything about that. And it can lead to, despondence, I would say. But God doesn't want us there. Vocation means he's calling us to respond to his voice in the moment. So
Yeah.
I think those movements of creation, fall, imagining what consummation or redemption of an industry or my work would look like, and then what's that little slice, that tearing off the edge of the darkness, what's that given to me?
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Another subject you talk about is self-awareness and relational intelligence. And we hit on this a little bit not too long ago. And some people have it, some people don't. I love the fact that you brought up the example of scientists, and how important it is that the scientists that are the kind of the most published, and and the ones that are kind of getting the most work done, are actually the most self-aware and have the most relational intelligence. Which living in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of engineers and scientists here. And so it kind of hit home a little bit. My wife used to work in an engineering department. And she's
Yeah.
like, there were certain people who like, they would walk by and they would not look you in the eye. And she's like, it is my goal to get them to say hi to me every morning. But when she left that company, like they were bringing her gifts and were thanking her for being so kind and smiley and happy. So you're like, okay, I never saw that on your face, but apparently that's what you were doing when you were walking by. So talk a little bit about what that looks like in our workplace. That's self-awareness, relational intelligence. Yeah, let's just talk about that quick.
Yeah, great story. Yeah, I think there's a competition between engineers and accountants for those who probably have the lowest natural affinity for that. Yeah, so again, one of the chapters was embrace relationships, and it's because God is by nature relationship. He is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit of self-giving love for each member of the Trinity. So when we are made for relationship for one another, and I do think the way to become more relationally intelligent is to first be more aware of yourself. And I'll just be honest and confess, this has been a long journey for me. I was the guy that wanted to show up in every room to know all the right answer. I mean, a 5 in the Enneagram. I wanted to be the expert. I wanted to tell everybody how smart. That's just kind of what I was. And I still actually have that. You're probably hearing it right now. But that's just been a lot of my journey. And I had several people that just would walk alongside me that would not only help me understand the effect I was having on them, but what in the heck was I actually feeling right now? And why was I feeling it? And this has been a major journey for me as well. So, why do I respond very shortly with my kids or lack of patience and grace with them? Why do I feel prone to temptation at some times and not others? Why do I feel at some points a particular decision shouldn't be that big of a deal, but I feel incredible loss and grief and sadness?
Hmm.
A lot of my journey is what am I feeling? And then reflecting on why might I be feeling that?
Yeah.
And so I did write a little bit of book that is this in a chapter called Seek Deep Spiritual Health. And then there's another chapter called Embrace Relationships. But on that Seek Deep Spiritual Health, I think that journey to sort of awareness of emotional awareness of what we're feeling, maybe even why we're feeling it, that sort of opens up the heart to not go and fix everything that's wrong with you, but then to opens up the heart to say, God, you see all of these things.
Hmm.
I'm just going to offer them to you without trying to fix them, but I will invite you to fix them for me. I also think too, I want to fix every problem that's wrong with me so quickly. And I wrote this in the book too, that we don't become holy through effort, we become holy through association. That is just associating and being with God. That's actually how we change and how he transforms us as well. So I do think that journey of how am I feeling? Why am I feeling this? And then allowing the Spirit to work on me is a precursor then to some of these healthy workplace relationships. Because if I know what I'm feeling in this, if you're off a little bit, or if you said something that was a little harsher than usual, there may be a reason for that. And I might extend a little more grace to you because I've done the work myself, is that I know how I was feeling yesterday and I didn't feel like myself. I didn't feel well. And that's that starting point whereby you, as a believer in the workplace, you just don't go to water cooler evangelism. It's actually really knowing and being known and actually building some of these redemptive relationships with folks that I think can be really powerful. So it's a long journey, but I think that growing in awareness and then eventually emotional and relational intelligence is really important.
Yeah, that's good. Kind of the next kind of part in that is how do so we work in often we work in most people work in secular workplaces. All right, I don't know, you talk a little bit about the word secular as well, but places where they're either God is or the Christian God is not honored. Maybe the Christian God isn't accepted. Maybe the Christian God is just one amongst a whole group of other kind of, religious expressions that they will kind of allow from time to time to come up. But what does it look like to be Christian in a workplace where either maybe you have I call it the fear of HR, like, oh, HR is gonna, I'm gonna lose my job if, or that, even if it's kind of more of an inclusive environment where they're like, well, that's your story and that's okay, you're allowed to tell it, just don't make it my story. What does that look like, kind of as far as being a Christian in a work environment that may be a little hostile towards Christians in general? What's that look like?
Yeah, so a few different thoughts on that. I wrote one of the chapters was called Translating Your Convictions, and it's the question of how do I translate my Christian convictions in the environments that are not built around my Christian convictions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whether we call them secular or whether you call them pluralist, which I actually like that more, is that there's many different sort of foundational ideologies that are in the room. Some of them are very individualized, some of them are official religions, Buddhism or Hinduism or Judaism or Christianity or whatever it might be. But how do you do that? And I think the first thing that I encourage in the book is to start understanding the environment you're in. So David Miller is at Princeton University. He has a book called God at Work, and he wrote an article a while back that talked about these different postures toward faith in the workplace that I think are helpful. So one is faith avoiding, where faith is completely avoided. It's just not appropriate here. One is faith tolerant, where okay, that's fine, we'll tolerate, we'll accommodate you, but it's sort of annoying that we have to do that, but it is the First Amendment after all. You do have to do that. The third is faith based. These are contexts where it's very faith overt sort of environment throughout the whole company. I see that a lot in the South. I see that a lot in small businesses, and I see that Chick-fil-A. So I see that in some of those areas. And then he's got a framework called faith friendly as well. And let me come back to the faith friendly thing as well. I think there's actually a fifth category for our friends that are in places that are actually faith persecuting. So if you're a believer in Iran, for instance, there's contexts that are deeply faith persecuting for what it looks like to live out your faith in the workplace. So I think you have to first understand the environment in. So if you're in a faith avoiding context, that's going to say that's really not welcome here. You have to be pretty wise. You have to think about contextualizing words and language and stuff that points to a redemptive story of self-sacrifice, Jesus' sacrifice for us, in a way that maybe brings in stories of beauty, right? In a way that builds deep relationships first. If you're in a faith-based context, everybody's talking about Jesus all the time. That's different. Actually, I write in here, in those contexts, particularly in a business context, where there may be people that don't share Christian faith there, you're going to really want to offer context for them to share their perspective. Otherwise, they can be very quieted voices that don't actually have an opportunity to have real exchange. They just sort of put on I guess people around here do that sort of a thing. So I think the environment is really important. I also think some of the language we choose is really important, the types of values we live out. And I'll just give this one story. I had a friend, Scott, he worked in private equity. So for listeners, that's they don't live in that world. That's basically buying and selling businesses. But he said de facto their company mantra was profit, profit, and more profit. It was just sort of built around that. And that's not all private equity, but it probably is more than I would like. And he put on his whiteboard in his office his core values. And he wrote things like integrity and humility and grace and hope and care for others. So that language set, right? The people will like, that's weird. So it's not necessarily saying Jesus, right? But it is saying like, where does humility and grace come from in this context? Right. This is cutthroat. We're going to win this. So there are things that can be done where you're sort of leading people, even in a very hostile environment, leading people further and further into a world that has been, influenced by Christian faith.
Yeah, the whole kind of digging into the Christianese and kind of being overt. I think we have to be careful because it's very easy to slip into it. And me personally, I pastored for 17 years, and I work primarily within the Christian context most places I go. And it's very easy to slip into using all of the words that we all understand because we have a church language, and it makes sense to us, and we use that, and yet those words either mean something different in the larger culture, or they're offensive, or they're meaningless in the larger culture. Like I just don't, I don't understand. Or it's code word, right? Like, oh, be blessed. Well, that's code word for you're a Christian, right? And so,
Yeah, or that was totally a God thing. Sorry, what
right,
are we talking about? What would that actually mean if that was even for Christians, right? But there is a lot of that language that might not
yeah,
be the best bridge to a world that doesn't believe. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And I think that kind of goes back to that idea that you brought up a few times about embracing relationship.
mm,
And when we're in relationship with people and they see a consistency in how we respond and how we act, and we have words like that on our whiteboard, it can lead to conversations. Or they find out that you go to church. And that's always an interesting one for me. They find out you're a Christian or you go to church, and then you're a little bit under the microscope. You actually have to up your game around. Okay, once they know, it doesn't mean you're preaching, but your words, your actions, your life, the way we respond is preaching. So
yeah. And that goes back to, are we ourselves living in the kingdom, right? Are we living in the life of Christ in a moment to moment? Because at some point, you're not going to be able to hide who you are with either your family or with your coworkers. They're just going to see who you are and how you respond, and they're going to make
yeah,
judgments on that.
yeah,
And so for us to be the best apologetic is for us to be a certain kind of people. It really is the best. And I also say too, faith in the workplace, and we want others to know and understand our faith. We have to understand that the Holy Spirit is already initiating. He's already
good.
initiating with that other person.
Yeah,
So it's not my job to sort of plow open the door or make sure I prove to you I'm not that kind of Christian or those types of things. It's to be sensitive to the Spirit's calling in my own life, as well as to pay attention to somebody else well enough to know where might the Spirit be already initiating in their life. And God can do amazing things and break open little tiny cracks of opportunity in really good and beautiful ways too. But that means then that sort of paying attention. Not we're just not there at the workplace only to get stuff done, but we are there to get stuff done. But we're also there to be working with others and ultimately working with God in
yeah,
that context. So I do think that attention and attentiveness to people can itself be a winsome apologetic.
yeah. This next question will probably get us a little bit into discipleship, and there seems to be kind of the standard, how do I become more like Jesus? And it's like, well, read your Bible and do a devotion and go to church on Sunday and you'll be more like Jesus. And though all of that is true, so I'm not knocking it at all. But are there any practices? Because what you're discussing really is, I need to be a theologically grounded follower of Jesus. And then the way I live, whether it's at the workplace or at the grocery store, or hopefully while we're driving cars, which is one of the places that I probably look least like a Christian. But anyway, um,
Which is why don't put that thing on your bumper.
right, the
Don't put that.
fish should
It's
not
not
be
going to
there,
help. It's
right?
not going to
No.
help.
Uh, but tell us a little bit about that. Do you have any insights on kind of how do we purposefully start to integrate so that our
Yeah.
insides, now it's a natural expression of what's already being transformed inside of us?
Yeah, I think a couple of things, very practical. We at Denver Institute years ago, we put out a little booklet that you can get online, also download for free, called "Spiritual Disciplines for Our Work." So even these simple practices, the concept of spiritual disciplines is not so much discipline; it's a means of grace of receiving more and more who God is to become more alive and more filled with His life in the moment to moment. We just decided to apply some of that to the workplace, of liturgical prayers that you could do during the week, of confession, of being the person that celebrates others, a celebratory perspective at the workplace. Like there's a lot of good things that you can do to build in those habits that break down, the proverbial sacred secular divide, but also just in our own life where you're a Christian through and through.
Hmm.
You can also do things like, yeah, I need to go and apologize to somebody and ask for their forgiveness.
So good.
If you're a Christian, you have some Jesus Jesus is very clear about this. Leave your gift at the altar and go make it right with somebody.
Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
a very powerful thing, right? So I just think there are things we can do. Obviously, reading our Bible and going to church and those things, but there are spiritual disciplines and habits that you could apply to both your family as well as a work context that sort of says this is one cohesive life with God
Hmm.
in these contexts. And I would encourage people to just try even one one discipline a month, maybe, of I'm just going to check this out. What could it look like to be the one, that's working through this? And maybe you create a rule of life or a little bit of a habits for yourself of what this could look like as well. So I think that's been fruitful for me of it. Your faith, your life with Christ can't stop when you get in the car for work. We have to think about those rhythms constantly, knowing that God is still initiating with you even right now as you're listening to this podcast. What is he saying to us right now? And that could be in a meeting, and it could be as a full stack developer. I mean, there's all those opportunities where the Spirit is initiating with us, and for us to just build the habits and to receive what God is already doing.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. One of the things I tried to do when I was working in a corporate environment, as I was walking down the hallways, just pray for the people in the cubes that I was passing. And obviously it's short. Hey, be with Jeff today. Be with Susie. Be with so and so. I mean, it wasn't deep, involved prayers necessarily. Now, if you knew something was going on, maybe you'd pray a little bit longer. And it was no stopping, and my eyes were open. But it also, it for me, what it did was it's just brings God into my mind as I'm walking through, realizing that I'm working with people that may need to know him. Some may already.
Totally. Yeah, little practices like that they don't have to take much time, but you see people as intrinsically worthwhile. Or even 1 in 9 people in the American economy works in sales. You're selling something, right? Sales for the sake of commission, or sales genuinely for the sake of love your neighbor? Can you know them well enough to know what their needs are and whether or not your product or service meets that need? Right? I know we all have goals. We all have targets to hit. Daniel Pink says in his book that we're all selling something. I think he's right. We are actually all selling something. We're all trying to influence somebody. But I do think even a perspective toward I'm paying attention to somebody well enough on the other side of the table that, monks would say, like, what if Jesus is walking in the door? How would I treat that person? What if that client's there? I genuinely, like in my heart, I want what's good for them. And a lot of products and services do actually meet a real need, right? If you actually don't think your product or service meets any genuine human need, you should probably leave, right? But most do actually meet some kind of a need. And there, all of a sudden, you could see Christ present in your client. And then all of a sudden, we have the sanctification of our life that starts to move more and more in these areas where we wouldn't have maybe thought about it before.
Yeah, that's good. Our mechanic, he will tell us, hey, you're probably going to have to replace that in 5,000 miles. And I always appreciate that, because when 5,000 miles comes up and it needs to be replaced, not only was I warned so I could save a few bucks to replace it,
yeah, good work.
But I didn't feel like every time I go in, he's just trying to get $5 more out of me, right? It was that idea that, hey, it's fine. You can keep going, but just be aware that is going to go sideways at some point. And when it's interesting, though, when you have a salesperson, in this case, it was a mechanic, who does that, I trust him more. And I respect him more, and I want to take my car back there more. I guess I don't actually want to take my car into the shop that often, but I don't mind it because I realize, hey, he's maybe for me, right? He's going to think of me and not just try to take advantage of me. I'm not just a paycheck for him. So
yeah, and I love that theology really. One other point of the book: theology really does matter for all of life, including our work. And so, to your point right there of your mechanic. What if a competitor can actually meet somebody's need better than your product, and you gave somebody to a competitor because they're the real person? You say, hey, this person's going to be well served, right? This is where theology matters. Do you believe in a zero-sum game where there's not going to be enough, or do you believe in this abundant teeming creation where you start with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and you end with 12 basketfuls over? If that's like a foundational belief, there's enough. God will care for you. If those are there, it allows you to do good work, to serve people, and even give stuff away, because God will care for every one of your needs. And that sort of open-handedness, by the way, it's really good sales. It really is much better. People feel much more comfortable and trustworthy in you, and it tends actually to help the sales. Not all the time. Sometimes you just lose a sale, and Jesus doesn't guarantee success by any means, but it really does make a difference in our work life.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is, I think, just a challenge of life is living open-handed with God,
Amen.
because there are
Amen.
times where He's wanting to make a move, and when I'm clenching and I'm holding on to the sure thing, or I'm holding on to, or what I think is a sure thing anyway, or I'm holding on to what I have here, we we don't give God an opportunity to work in the midst of it because we're
Mm,
just tight-fisted, holding on to at least what I think is secure.
mm,
So I love that. At some point in the last 2 or 3 years, that was my New Year's resolution, was to live open handed with God. So
mm.
I have not achieved it with completeness, but
It's a good resolution.
it is a direction that I aim
That and our
for.
workout plans that we started in January, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I have a few generational questions for you. So this is what I'm
Sure.
going to ask you. Just kind of give advice, and I'm going to give you three scenarios, and they happen to all be in my family. So this one is from my dad, Bill Sands, Dr. Bill Sands.
Okay.
He is in his late 70s. He has worked in meaningful and impactful things since his 20s. All right, so what are we looking at? 50 plus years now of doing great stuff. And his final project, which again is a meaningful and impactful project, literally it's coming to end on June 3rd. They're having a celebration to open what he has started, and then he will fade because he was the builder of it, not the executor of this moving on. My dad does not have hobbies. My dad does not like to piddle around the house. He does not like to do little things in the yard. What do you say to a gentleman or gentlewoman who are, moving out of their earning years, maybe, but still have so much to give? And if we believe that God gives us, purpose is something that drives us. What do you say to Bill Sands? What are you giving for him today?
Sure. Okay. I'll speak directly to Dr. Bill Sands. Dr. Bill, it's nice to meet you. I'd love to shake your hand sometime. Sounds like you've had an incredible career. Here's the thing I would say: read my book called An Uncommon Guide to Retirement, Finding God's Purpose for the Next Season of Life. So, in that book, I lay out just that situation. You are retiring. This season has shifted, and that's actually okay. But you also may not want to do the vacation on the beach thing for the next 10 years or 20 years or whatever. But you realize that the season is changing. So I actually recommend in the book that he takes a sabbatical. It could be 3 months, 6 months, or a year. You take an intentional season of sabbatical rhythms, of listening to God's voice, of rest, of asking what's next. And then you re-engage in some other vision of committed service to God and neighbor. And that could be work, it could be paid, it could be unpaid, it could be family, it could be grandkids, but vocation lasts for a lifetime. So yeah, I talk a lot more about retirement in the book, but I think there is good biblical frameworks for what it means to be what I call an elder in society.
Awesome. Awesome. I'll get that book sent to him right away.
Great.
All right. The next one is to our daughter Annika. She is 18. She's a freshman in college. She's going to be entering her career in the next, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, 3, 4, 5 years, right? What do you say to our generation who's coming up and they're just getting started with a career? What would your kind of advice be to people who are just starting on the path?
Love it. Annika, nice to meet you. I would love to meet you sometime. I have a 15-year-old daughter who's not quite there, but in a similar life stage. Yeah, I'd say on the work front, be willing to do the job that nobody else is willing to do. So in the summers between college, maybe during school, just work and learn and pay attention to yourself and to those around you. So I think a lot of folks have, yeah, let's see, what did I work at in college? I worked at Green Stuff. I fertilized lawns. I worked as a server at Popolanos, where I brought people food and messed up a lot of orders. I worked for one summer as a camp counselor, which was both great and incredibly oppressive in terms of the quantity of hours. I lost weight all summer. The Lord used each of those in my life as well. So I think actually even coming out of school, I think there is a lot of language about you got this degree, you're going to impact the world, you're going to make a huge impact. And I'd say maybe, but as you start your career, just be willing to take something and to hop in and to learn Maybe it's a sales role, maybe it's a low level manufacturing role, whatever that might be. I think early career is about learning the job. I think it's about learning about those around you, and I think it's about learning about ourselves.
Awesome. All right. Last one is to my wife and I. We're kind of mid-career,
Yep.
we're on the other side, but still have, somewhere between 10 and 20 years left of work. So we've kind of grown up, done those jobs that you've described. I didn't do all of
Right.
those, but I worked in that genre for a while, record stores and gardening and, anyway, whatever. But what do you say to people who are mid-career and like, even considering, do we keep doing what we're doing? Do we transition to something else? Like, what do you say to people who are just kind of right in the middle, but have enough experience that they're not, starting out at the lawn company?
Yeah. What would we say to ourselves? Maybe you could share some advice with me too, Elliot, because I'd love to hear. Dante's Inferno starts with, I was at that midpoint of life and I found myself in a dark wood and I got lost. And honestly, that can happen to a lot of folks. Here's what I think is interesting about our season of life is that the 20s or even 30s, whereby making the big impact on the world, building the big thing, may not quite have the same draw as it used to. Um, my concern actually midlife is when people retreat into, I'm now being paid more, I can afford more of these things for myself, and they
Mm-hmm.
actually are well-paid technicians that sort of disengage parts of their heart from work, and take the fruits of what they've built in their 20s and 30s and kind of this I deserve it sort of a mentality. And I've actually seen some of those temptations in my life. I actually think the big thing for us is, this is the question of the book, which is what I was going to title the book, but my publisher said it was too esoteric. The question is, I think, who am I becoming? Who am I becoming in the process of what I do? Not like what I'm accomplishing,
Mm-hmm.
but who am I becoming? Because who do I really want to become? I want to be somebody filled with love and joy and peace and wisdom and grace and humility. I want to become a certain kind of man. And so the real hurdles and the real challenge of this part of a career are, if I lost my temper with somebody today, that's the thing I need to work on this month. And I have these other things. I have these, work related things I have to get done too. But I actually think those are the types of things that I'm inviting more and more of the Spirit into, because my vision of a good life in the future is to become like your dad, to become filled with peace and joy and wisdom and vibrancy, and not sort of check out, not blame others, and stay in the game, but Lord willing, from a place of a little bit more wisdom than I have in my 20s. So, but I'll reverse that question to you, Elliot. What would you say to me, since we're both the same age?
Yeah, I first off, I really like that idea, and as you say it, it resonated with me. Is the who am I becoming? Because I've seen what the 20 and 30 and into my 40-year-old person was, as far as the way they responded and reacted and maybe treated people around me, whether it's in my home or in the workplace. And so a lot is, am I better? Am I becoming better? And day by day. I'm challenged between, I'm not done and I'm not close to being done, but there's part of me that feels like I feel like I've done a lot already. And do I need to do more? And my retirement account says yes. So we continue to work. So how do I now work in a way that what I'm doing is purposeful and meaningful and impactful, which honestly is what I set out to do, in my late 20s, early 30s when I left industry. And for me, it's finishing strong. It's how do we continue to kind of persevere through, bring this hopefully wisdom and growth and understanding that I've been able to gather over 25 years of working, and bring that to bear in a really fun, impactful way as a good person, like you're saying, as
Yeah,
a person who's becoming more joyful, maybe more hopeful. But that doesn't mean I have to turn off my news feed from time to time to become more
right.
hopeful. And that is also wisdom, and that is realizing catching my internal stuff before they become external stuff. And I think that's a kind of another big challenge that I journey through.
Yeah. And I would say, too, one book I really enjoy actually on this topic, Arthur Brooks wrote a book called From Strength to Strength, and he talks about this transition in mid-career. And one of it is to what he calls crystallized intelligence, where you don't have the same sort of ability to, I can't get as much done, I can't solve as many problems, my brain is frankly just working a little more slowly. But that crystallized intelligence is, you've seen this pattern before. You're able to take a look at moral and sort of situational things and draw on a lifetime experience. And I actually think in your 40s and your 50s, that's what's valuable. That's why people, become consultants or in senior leadership roles. It's not because of how much work they can get done, but it's because of wisdom.
Yeah.
It's because of wisdom. So becoming a person of wisdom, I think, is one of my goals as well as figuring out how my retirement account will eventually hit anything near what it ought to be when I am older.
When it's time to hang up the paying job. So
yeah,
that's good. I love it. All right. This is my final question for you.
Sure.
What's exciting you right now? What project, trend, Bible verse, something happening in your life? When you think about it, you're encouraged. What's that thing for you right now?
Yeah, one thing I'm encouraged by, one of the projects I'm working on is with my church, and we're finding new sort of non-traditional ways to form and train future Anglican leaders in the United States. So I think some of the non-traditional, meaning you did seminary, you got a lot of theological knowledge, but some of the stuff that we're talking about even on this podcast, our emotional and relational and spiritual health, growing in wisdom, these things, I think there's a real need for that for training a future clergy. So I'm excited about that. And I also just say my church, Wellspring, here in Englewood, it is a place filled with the Spirit. And I've experienced almost second and third and fourth conversions there. And it's reminded me that God is actually present and alive in his creation. Yeah. And that gives me so much hope, especially when I get discouraged by my own behavior or what's going on in the world. He is actually still there. So that's what encourages me.
That's good. That's good. I love it. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate you joining us here on this podcast. And for everybody out there, let's go live faith first.